I never thought life would begin again at 70, but the day I picked up that old paintbrush, something inside me woke up and everything started to change. I was 70 when I realized how still my life had become. The mornings blended into afternoons, and the evenings slipped quietly into night, each one mirroring the last like a tired reflection in water. I would wake to silence, the kind that presses against your chest until you start to feel it instead of hear it. I would make my coffee, sit by the same window, and watch the world go by from the same chair. People walked their dogs, cars hummed down the street, the sky shifted from gold to gray and back again, and through it all I sat there, invisible but present. My children called when they could, their voices sweet but distant, like a song playing from another room. My friends, the few who were left, were scattered, some lost to distance, others to time. There were days I would not speak a single word aloud, and it frightened me how natural that started to feel. I had thought loneliness would come like a storm, loud and demanding, but instead it came like snow, soft and quiet, until it covered everything. There were nights I would stare at the ceiling and wonder how my life had become so small. I had done everything I was supposed to. I had raised my children, kept my home, stood beside my husband through every struggle until the day I buried him. I had been needed for so long, and then all at once, I was not. The days stretched endlessly, each one asking the same question: what now? One afternoon, while trying to organize old boxes I had avoided for years, I came across a small metal tin covered in scratches. When I opened it, a familiar scent of dry paint and paper drifted up, and I felt something flutter inside me. It was my old watercolor set, the one I used when I was a girl. I could see myself clearly again, sitting barefoot on the back porch painting flowers on old envelopes, my hair tied in ribbons, my heart open to everything the world could be. I had not thought of that girl in decades, and the memory hit me so suddenly that I had to sit down. I ran my fingers over the dried colors, almost afraid they would crumble. I smiled without meaning to, and then tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I whispered to myself, maybe I could try again. The words sounded strange in the quiet room, but they stayed with me all evening. The next morning, without planning to, I got dressed, put on my old coat, and drove to the little art store near the center of town. It felt strange being out for no reason other than wanting to do something for myself. The man behind the counter looked at me kindly when I told him it had been 50 years since I painted. He said softly, "It is never too late to start again." Something in his voice made me believe him. I left the store holding a new set of paints and a few blank canvases, my heart racing like I was doing something secret and wonderful. When I got home, I cleared the dining table, spread old newspapers across it, and set everything up. I stood there for a long time, brush in hand, afraid to begin. Then I dipped it in blue and let it touch the paper. The color spread unevenly, soft and unsure, just like my hands. The next stroke came easier, then another, and another. I did not think about what I was painting. I just let the colors move. I painted until my coffee went cold and the light outside shifted into evening. When I finally stepped back, I laughed. It was messy, clumsy, and not even close to beautiful, but it was mine. My heart felt lighter than it had in years. That night, as I washed the brushes in the sink, I caught my reflection in the window. My hair was gray, my face lined with time, but there was something alive in my eyes again. I thought of my husband then, and for the first time since he passed, I did not feel only sadness. I felt like I was giving both of us permission to live again, even if only through colors on a page. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Instead of reaching for my phone or turning on the news, I reached for my brushes. The sound of bristles against paper became the rhythm of my morning. Each day, I learned something new about patience, about how colors blend, how mistakes can turn into beauty if you let them. I painted small things at first: the cup by my window, the shadow of my hand, a petal that had fallen from a flower on the counter. And as the days went on, something inside me began to bloom again. I no longer watched life pass by through the window. I was part of it now, even if only from my little corner of the world. The silence in the house no longer felt heavy. It became space for thought, for creation, for me. I realized that joy does not disappear with age. It only hides, waiting for you to remember where you left it. And that day, I had found mine again, in a tin box of old paints and a forgotten dream. The mornings began to feel different after that. The air still carried the same stillness, but it was no longer empty. There was something waiting for me when I woke up, something that made me move with purpose again. I would make my coffee, set it beside my paints, and open the curtains to let the light spill across the table. The soft hum of the world outside became background music to my small rituals. Some days the colors came easily, flowing like a memory I had never forgotten. Other days I would sit for hours, staring at a blank page, feeling both the weight of time and the quiet thrill of beginning again. It was strange how something so simple could shift the way I saw everything. When I looked out the window now, I didn't just see people passing by. I noticed their details. The way a woman held her bag close as she crossed the street. The way sunlight caught the rim of a bicycle wheel. The way children laughed with their whole bodies. The world had texture again, and I found myself wanting to capture it before it slipped away. One afternoon while painting, I heard a soft knock at my door. It was Emily, my neighbor from across the street. She was younger, maybe in her 40s, and had always been kind in the polite, distant way people often are. She smiled when she saw the paint spread across the table and said she didn't know I was an artist. I almost laughed at the word, but she meant it sincerely. I told her I was only trying to remember how. She looked at my work for a moment, then asked if I would teach her. I hesitated, the old instinct to say no rising automatically, but something in her expression made me say yes. The next morning, she came with her daughter, a quiet girl who carried a sketchbook under her arm. We sat together by the window, three women from different chapters of life, connected by colors and silence. I showed them how to mix shades, how to let the water lead, how not to fight the imperfection. They were clumsy at first, just as I had been, but there was laughter in the room, and it filled every corner of the house. It felt alive again. Over the next few weeks, they came often. We painted flowers, fruit, the view from the kitchen, anything that caught our eyes. We talked, too, about little things, recipes, memories, the strange ways life surprises you. I began to look forward to their visits more than I wanted to admit. It was not just the company, it was the sense of belonging I had missed without realizing it. One afternoon, while cleaning brushes, Emily looked at me and said, "You seem different, lighter." I paused and thought about it. Maybe I was. It wasn't something I could measure, but I felt it in the way I woke up in the morning and how I went to sleep with a quiet sense of satisfaction. It felt like I had found my way back to myself. The next week, Emily brought one of her friends who had heard about our little painting sessions. Then another joined, and before I knew it, my quiet house had turned into a small art circle. Every Thursday they would come, with paints and snacks and stories. We laughed, spilled water, argued over colors, and sometimes sat in silence, each lost in thought. It was beautiful. I never imagined that something as personal as rediscovering an old passion could ripple outward like that, but it did. One evening, after everyone left, I sat alone, surrounded by the faint smell of paint and coffee. I looked at the walls now covered with our work. Some pieces were unfinished, others proudly signed. It felt like the house was breathing again. For years it had been filled only with echoes. Now it had laughter woven into its walls. I thought about how life keeps giving chances to begin again, if you are brave enough to take them. I had been afraid to start because I thought I was too old to create something new. But sitting there that night, I realized age had nothing to do with it. The heart doesn't forget how to dream. It only waits for permission. A few days later, Emily suggested we display our paintings at the community center. I almost refused. The idea made me nervous. I didn't want anyone judging what I had created with such fragile honesty, but she insisted it would be good for all of us. After a week of convincing, I agreed. The night of the small exhibition, I wore my blue dress, the one I hadn't worn since my husband's last birthday. The center was warm and filled with soft music and laughter. People stopped to look at our paintings, and I watched quietly from a corner. When someone paused in front of mine and smiled, something inside me stirred. It wasn't pride exactly, it was more like recognition. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a widow or a mother or an old woman, but as myself. When the night ended, Emily hugged me tightly and said this was only the beginning. On the drive home, I kept thinking about her words. The beginning. I was 71 years old, and somehow that was true. I had started again in a way I never thought possible. When I got home, I placed one of my favorite paintings on the mantel. It was of a sunrise, soft pinks fading into pale gold. It reminded me of the morning I opened that old tin box. That was the moment everything changed. As I turned off the lights and walked to bed, I felt a calm sense of gratitude settle over me. Life had not given me what I expected, but it had given me something just as precious, the chance to feel alive again, in my own, quiet way. After that night at the community center, something in me shifted. I began to move through the days with a quiet kind of excitement, the kind that made every small thing feel alive again. When I opened the curtains in the morning, the light seemed warmer, as if it knew it had finally found a way back into my heart. I would make my coffee, take a deep breath, and feel grateful to be awake. The loneliness that once sat beside me at breakfast had softened into something gentler, something almost familiar, but no longer painful. It amazed me how much a simple brush, some water, and a handful of colors could change the rhythm of my life. My house became my little world, alive with canvases propped against the walls and paint-stained rags hanging over chairs. The smell of turpentine and old wood mixed with the scent of roses from the garden, and I loved how those two worlds blended, nature and art, life and memory. Sometimes I would paint in silence, letting the hours stretch and fold without noticing the time. Other days, I would put on music from my younger years and let it fill the room until I felt my heart beating in step with the melody. I found myself smiling more, humming even. I caught my reflection one afternoon and realized I hadn't looked at myself like that in years. There were lines and silver strands that time had left behind, but there was also something new in my eyes, a kind of light I thought I had lost. One afternoon, while I was painting a vase of sunflowers, I felt a sudden urge to write. I had not written anything in a long time, not since I used to scribble in journals that eventually ended up in drawers. I found an old notebook and began to write about what painting had done for me, how it had quietly pulled me back into the world. I wrote for hours without stopping, my words spilling like the paint across the page. When I finished, I felt lighter, as if some hidden weight had lifted. The next day, I brought the notebook with me to our Thursday art circle. The women gathered as they always did, chatting and unpacking their brushes. After a while, I told them I had written something and asked if they wanted to hear it. They all nodded. As I read, the room grew quiet. When I looked up, I saw tears in their eyes. Ruth reached across the table and took my hand. She said, "You should share this with others. There are people out there who need to hear it." Her words echoed in me long after they left. That night, I lay awake thinking about what she had said. For most of my life, I had been afraid to show myself, to speak too loudly, to take up space. I was always someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's friend. I had never learned how to simply be me. But now, in this stage of life when the world had grown quieter, I was finally beginning to find my voice. The next morning, I went through my old boxes and found a folder of unfinished paintings from my youth. Some were faded, others torn, but each one carried a story. I spent the entire day restoring them, layering color over the old strokes, breathing new life into them. It felt symbolic, like I was healing parts of myself that had been left behind. As I painted, I thought about the years that had passed, the dreams I had once buried beneath routine and responsibility. I thought about the times I had told myself it was too late, that my moment had already come and gone. But sitting there, surrounded by color, I realized that time doesn't decide when our story ends. We do. A few weeks later, I received a call from the community center. They were planning another exhibition, this one larger, and they wanted to feature my work. For a moment, I was speechless. My first instinct was to say no. The thoughts of my paintings hanging on walls for strangers to see made me nervous. But then I remembered that younger version of myself who had once dreamed of this very thing, and I said yes. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. I chose 10 of my favorite pieces, framed them, and touched up the corners. On the night of the exhibition, the hall was filled with soft lights and gentle music. People walked through slowly, pausing at each painting, and I stood in a corner, watching them. One woman stopped in front of a piece I had titled The Window of Morning. It was a painting of my kitchen window, sunlight spilling across a coffee cup. She turned to me and said, "It feels like hope." Her words caught me by surprise, and I had to look away for a moment to hide the tears in my eyes. Hope. That was what I had been searching for all along, without realizing it. After the show, a young man approached me and asked if he could interview me for a small local magazine. He wanted to write about late bloomers, people who discovered new passions later in life. I agreed, though part of me still couldn't believe anyone would want to hear my story. When the article came out, it was simple and honest. He wrote about my journey from loneliness to renewal, about how creativity doesn't fade with age, it deepens. The response surprised me. I started receiving letters from people I had never met, some thanking me for reminding them that it was never too late to start again. One letter came from a woman in her 60s who wrote, "You made me pick up my old violin today." That single line made me cry. To think that my small return to painting could ripple outward like that, reaching strangers I would never meet, felt like a quiet miracle. I pinned that letter to the wall above my desk. It reminded me every day that our lives, no matter how ordinary they seem, can still inspire light in others. And as I sat there with my brush in hand, the house filled once again with the soft hum of creation, I realized I was no longer just painting flowers or landscapes. I was painting proof that life, even in its final chapters, can still bloom beautifully. After the article came out, the days began to unfold in ways I hadn't expected. My world, which once felt small and quiet, started to widen. Strangers would stop me at the grocery store or outside the post office and tell me how much my story meant to them. Some were young, chasing dreams of their own, and others were closer to my age, trying to remember what dreams felt like. Their kindness humbled me. I had lived so long thinking my life had already been written, that the story was nearing its end. But here I was, discovering new pages every day. It amazed me how art had become a bridge, connecting me not just to others, but to myself. I began teaching small workshops at the community center on Saturday mornings. At first, I wasn't sure anyone would come, but the room filled quickly. There were women in their 50s who wanted to learn something new, men who had lost their wives and needed something to fill the silence, and even a shy teenage girl who came with her grandmother. We started simply, just mixing colors and talking about what each shade made us feel. Sometimes our conversations drifted far from painting. We talked about life, about loss, about the quiet ache of missing people who once filled our days. There were moments of laughter that echoed through the room, and moments of silence that felt like understanding. I realized that the art we were making wasn't just on the canvas. It was in the way we shared our stories, in the way we listened to one another. One morning, after class, I stayed behind to clean the brushes. The light from the window fell across the tables, catching the dust in the air, and for a moment I stood still, overwhelmed by gratitude. I thought about how strange it was that something so simple could bring such peace. I used to think purpose was something big, something grand that defined your place in the world. Now I understood it could be something small and quiet, something that made you feel whole when no one else was watching. A few weeks later, Ruth invited me to her home for tea. She said she wanted to show me her garden. When I arrived, the air smelled of lavender and freshly cut grass. She led me to the backyard, where rows of wildflowers swayed in the breeze. She told me she had started planting them after her husband passed because she couldn't stand the emptiness. Watching her walk through the flowers, touching each petal with care, I realized that grief and beauty often grow side by side. We sat there for hours, talking about everything and nothing. At one point, she looked at me and said, "You know, when I first met you, you looked like someone who was fading, but now you glow." Her words stayed with me. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my reflection again. The lines were still there, the years still written across my skin, but she was right. There was a glow, a quiet radiance that came not from youth, but from peace. I was no longer mourning what was gone. I was living what was here. Painting had taught me that beauty doesn't come from perfection, but from presence. It's in the way colors bleed into one another, in the mistakes that create something unexpected. Life is the same way. The following month, the community center hosted a charity event, and they asked if I could donate one of my paintings for auction. I chose a piece I had painted after visiting Ruth's garden, full of purples and yellows and soft greens. On the night of the event, I watched as people gathered around it, bidding higher than I ever imagined. When it finally sold, I felt a mix of joy and disbelief. The money went to a local shelter for women starting over, and that thought filled me with quiet pride. I knew what it felt like to start over. It wasn't just about survival. It was about remembering that even in loss, there can be renewal. That night, when I returned home, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea and listened to the hum of the world outside. I thought about my husband and how much he would have loved this version of me, how he used to tell me I saw the world differently. I closed my eyes and imagined him smiling, telling me he always knew I'd find my way back. It wasn't sadness I felt anymore, but something deeper, a connection that time couldn't break. The next morning, I painted again. The colors felt brighter, freer, as if the canvas itself was breathing. I didn't worry about technique or form. I just let my heart lead. Each brushstroke felt like a word in a story I was still writing. I painted until the lights shifted and the day slipped quietly into evening. When I finally put the brush down, I looked at what I had created. It was a painting of my studio window, sunlight spilling across the table, a mug of coffee half full beside it. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it felt like me. I smiled and whispered softly to the empty room, "You're still here." In that moment, I realized something I had never truly understood before. Life doesn't stop being beautiful because it changes. It only stops when we forget to look for it. And as long as I had color, canvas, and the courage to begin again, I would never stop looking. There were mornings when I still woke up feeling the weight of silence pressing against the walls. It wasn't the kind of silence that hurt anymore, but the kind that reminded me of all the voices that used to fill this house. My husband's laughter, the sound of my children running down the hallway, the hum of a life that once felt so full. Sometimes I would close my eyes and imagine it all still here, just behind the veil of memory. Then I would take a deep breath, open my eyes, and start my day. I had learned that the heart doesn't forget. It just learns how to carry what it loves differently. My routine became its own kind of comfort. I would water the plants, feed the stray cat that had started visiting my porch, and then sit by the window with my sketchbook. There was something healing about drawing before painting, about letting the pencil glide across the page, tracing ideas that only my heart could understand. I didn't plan what I was going to paint anymore. I simply followed the feeling. One morning, I found myself sketching a chair by the sea, empty yet peaceful, with the sun just beginning to rise. It wasn't until I finished that I realized it was a reflection of how I felt, alone, but not lonely anymore. The emptiness had turned into space, a place where new things could grow. Around that time, the community center decided to start a monthly art gathering where anyone could share their work, no matter how simple or unfinished. Ruth convinced me to present something. I chose that painting of the chair by the sea. When it was my turn, I stood in front of the small group, my hands trembling slightly, and talked about what the painting meant to me. As I spoke, I saw people nodding, eyes soft, understanding something without needing me to explain too much. Afterward, a man from the back came up to me and said, "That's exactly how I felt after my wife passed. You put it on canvas." His words filled me with warmth. For so long, I had painted for myself, but that moment made me realize that art could also be a language of healing for others. In giving my pain a shape, I had given someone else permission to feel theirs too. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the moon climb across the sky, thinking about how strange and beautiful it was that our stories could touch strangers we might never meet again. It made me want to create more, to keep expressing everything I had once been too afraid to say out loud. So I began painting daily again, sometimes well past midnight, losing myself in color until my fingers ached. My house became a gallery of emotion. Every wall told a different story of grief, of growth, of grace. Some days I would paint in silence. Other days with music so soft it felt like a heartbeat beneath the brushstrokes. There were moments I cried without knowing why, the kind of tears that came from places too deep to name. And there were times I laughed, remembering something simple my husband used to say, and it felt like he was right there, watching me paint. A few months later, I decided to take a walk through the park near the community center. The trees were changing color, the air crisp and filled with the scent of earth and leaves. As I walked, I saw an elderly man sitting on a bench, sketching something in a notebook. He looked up and smiled, and somehow, without words, we began a conversation. His name was Henry. He had been an architect before retiring, and now he spent his mornings sketching buildings that no longer stood. We started meeting there every week, not because we planned to, but because it just happened naturally. He would bring his sketchbook and I would bring mine. Sometimes we talked about art, sometimes about life, and sometimes we just sat in silence, watching the world move around us. It wasn't friendship in the ordinary sense. It was something quieter, built on shared solitude. One day, he showed me a drawing of an old bridge, strong but cracked, and said, "That's how I feel most days. Still standing, but not untouched." I smiled and told him that was the most honest kind of beauty. Our talks reminded me that connection doesn't always come with noise or words. Sometimes it's just the comfort of being seen, of being understood without explanation. As the weeks passed, our small meetings became a cherished part of my routine. I would bring him cookies from home, and he would tell me stories from his travels. We never crossed any boundaries, never filled the silence with what wasn't there. We just shared the simplicity of two souls who had lived enough to know the value of stillness. There was something tender about it, something healing. It reminded me that companionship, even in its most fragile form, could bring light back into the corners of life that had grown dim. That winter, I painted a piece inspired by those mornings in the park. It showed two figures sitting quietly beneath the golden sky, the light soft and forgiving. When I finished it, I titled it Stillness. I gave it to Henry, and he looked at it for a long time before saying, "You captured peace." That was the greatest compliment I had ever received. Later that evening, as I sat in my studio, I realized how much had changed since the day I picked up that first brush again. My life had gone from a long stretch of quiet emptiness to something rich with meaning. I had found not just art, but a reason to wake up every morning. I had found community, friendship, purpose, and most of all, myself. It wasn't about painting perfect pictures or filling the silence with noise. It was about living with presence, about learning that even in the later chapters of life, the heart can still surprise you with new beginnings. Winter lingered longer than usual that year, and the mornings carried a softness that made everything feel slowed down, as if the world itself had decided to move gently for a while. I began waking earlier, wrapped in a blanket, holding my coffee close as the first light crept through the curtain. There was something comforting about those quiet hours, when the world was still half asleep and my thoughts could drift freely. I often found myself thinking about how much had changed, not just around me, but inside me too. The woman who used to wake to silence and dread the long hours ahead was gone. In her place was someone curious again, someone open. My life had not become extraordinary in any grand way, but it had grown fuller, richer, more honest. Every morning held a reason to move, to create, to simply exist with purpose. I had come to love that feeling. One morning, as I stood in front of my easel, I noticed how the light hit the canvas differently. The sun was lower, the air outside colder, and yet the warmth inside my home made everything glow. I started painting what I saw: a bowl of oranges on the table, the faint steam from my coffee rising in the air, the muted gold of the curtains. It wasn't dramatic, just ordinary life, but it felt beautiful because it was mine. I realized then that art didn't always have to be about big emotions or grand stories. Sometimes it was about honoring the quiet moments that shaped us when no one else was looking. A few days later, Ruth called and asked if I would help her organize a new project at the community center. She wanted to start an art program for seniors who had never painted before. I said yes immediately. The first day we opened the doors, only 5 people showed up, but they came with a spark in their eyes that reminded me of myself not long ago. There was a retired teacher who wanted to paint flowers, a man who said he used to draw cartoons for his kids, and a quiet woman who confessed she hadn't held a brush since she was a teenager. As I watched them paint, I saw the same mixture of hesitation and wonder I had once felt. It moved me deeply. By the end of the session, the room was full of laughter, color, and a kind of peace that words couldn't describe. When everyone left, Ruth looked at me and said softly, "This is what purpose feels like." I nodded, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I went home that day feeling lighter than I had in years. The program grew quickly. Within a few months, we had more people than the room could hold. The walls of the community center became a gallery of stories: portraits of lost loves, landscapes of childhood homes, and bright, abstract pieces that spoke of freedom. Every painting carried a piece of a life, a whisper of memory, a fragment of hope. Watching it all unfold made me realize that we all carry art inside us, even if we forget how to let it out. One evening, after class, I stayed behind to clean the brushes. The air smelled faintly of paint and coffee. The sound of rain tapped softly against the windows. I stood there for a while, just listening, feeling the deep, steady rhythm of contentment. There was no rush, no fear, just the quiet truth that I was exactly where I was meant to be. I thought of my husband then, and for the first time in a long time, the memory of him didn't ache. It felt gentle, like a soft touch on the shoulder. I imagined him smiling at me, maybe even teasing me about how many paint-stained shirts I had ruined by now. I laughed quietly to myself. In that moment, I realized that grief doesn't leave, it transforms. It becomes a companion rather than a wound, walking beside us as we learn how to live again. That night, I couldn't resist painting one more piece. I painted a path leading through a forest of golden trees, light filtering between the branches, and at the end of the path, a small figure walking forward, her face turned toward the light. When I finished, I felt tears on my cheeks, not of sadness, but of gratitude. It was my journey, captured on canvas, the story of finding my way back to myself. The next morning, I brought the painting to the community center and hung it near the entrance. People stopped to look at it, and some smiled, some grew quiet, and others whispered that it made them feel hopeful. That was enough for me. As the days passed, I began to notice how differently I carried myself. I no longer moved through life waiting for something to happen. I was part of the happening. Each day was a creation in itself, even the small, uneventful ones. I started journaling again, writing not just about painting, but about feelings, thoughts, and little things that made me smile. Sometimes I shared those writings with the group, and it always amazed me how much a few honest words could touch people. One afternoon, after class, a woman approached me and said, "You've changed the way I see my days. I used to wake up and feel like nothing mattered. Now, I look for color everywhere." Her words made my heart swell. I told her that color was always there, waiting. We just forget to notice it. That night, when I returned home, I stood by the window and watched the snow begin to fall. Each flake drifted gently, settling on the world like a soft promise. I thought about all the years I had lived, all the moments I had lost and found, and how everything had led me here. The quiet didn't scare me anymore. It felt sacred, like the pause between heartbeats. As I stood there, I whispered to myself that life is not measured by how much time we have left, but by how deeply we live the time we're given. And as long as there was breath in me, I would keep painting, keep creating, keep loving the simple wonder of being alive. Spring arrived quietly that year, almost shy in its entrance. The snow melted away in small sighs, revealing soft patches of green that seemed to breathe after a long sleep. I remember walking through the park one morning, the air still cool, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and new beginnings. The trees were waking too, their bare branches showing hints of color, and the sound of birds returned like a melody I hadn't realized I missed so deeply. I stood there for a long time, watching a small child chase a butterfly, her laughter echoing in the open air. Something about that moment touched me. It reminded me how joy, even in the smallest forms, had a way of healing what words never could. That day, when I returned home, I opened all the windows and let the breeze sweep through the rooms. The curtains fluttered like soft wings, and, for a second, the whole house felt alive again. I put on an old record, one I hadn't played in years, and the familiar tune filled the space. I began to dance, not gracefully, but freely, my bare feet sliding across the wooden floor. It felt strange and beautiful to move without purpose, without anyone watching. I laughed out loud, alone but not lonely, and that sound felt like the truest thing I had made in a long time. Later that afternoon, I visited the community center again. The art program had grown so much that Ruth and I decided to expand it into different classes: poetry, pottery, even music. People were signing up faster than we expected. There was something electric about that little place, something that pulled people toward it. It wasn't about art anymore. It was about connection, about rediscovering pieces of ourselves we thought were lost. I had started mentoring a young woman named Claire who reminded me so much of my younger self. She was quiet, often unsure, always second-guessing her work. One evening, she showed me a painting of her childhood home, a soft watercolor full of light and memory. It was beautiful, yet she couldn't see it. "It doesn't feel right," she said, frowning. I told her gently that art rarely feels perfect because it reflects truth, and truth isn't always tidy. She smiled faintly, and I saw in her eyes that she understood. Watching her grow gave me a sense of pride I hadn't felt since raising my own children. There was something deeply fulfilling about guiding someone else toward their voice, the same way I had once searched for mine. Life began to flow with a rhythm that felt steady and kind. I had dinners with friends, long walks in the evenings, quiet mornings spent sketching by the window. There were still moments when sadness came like a shadow, uninvited but familiar. I no longer tried to fight it. Instead, I let it sit beside me for a while, knowing it would pass. I learned that peace doesn't mean never feeling pain. It means learning to coexist with it, to keep moving anyway. One night, as I was closing up the studio, Ruth handed me a letter. "You should read this," she said softly. It was from a man named Thomas, one of our first students who had stopped coming after his wife passed. In his letter, he thanked us for giving him back his mornings, for reminding him that beauty still existed. He wrote that painting had become his way of talking to her, of keeping her near. I sat there reading his words, my eyes blurring with tears. It struck me how deeply art could reach into people's lives, how it could stitch something back together without fanfare or noise. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the souls who had walked through those doors, carrying their silent stories. I realized then that we were all artists, even if our canvases looked different. Some of us painted, some wrote, some simply lived each day with quiet grace, and all of it was creation. A few weeks later, Ruth suggested hosting an exhibition. We'll call it Moments, she said, because that's what we've been collecting. The idea thrilled everyone. The students worked for weeks, pouring their hearts into their pieces. On the night of the show, the hall glowed with soft light and low murmurs of excitement. People moved from one painting to another, pausing, smiling, sometimes crying. When it came time for me to speak, I felt my throat tighten. I stood there, looking at the faces of people who had become like family. "These walls," I said, "are filled with our lives. Every stroke, every color, every tear behind the paint tells a story of survival, of courage, of finding beauty in the everyday." The room grew still, and in that quiet, I felt a warmth spread through me. After the event, as I helped take down the decorations, Ruth hugged me tightly. "You've built something beautiful here," she whispered. I smiled, though I knew it wasn't just me. It was all of us, carrying one another through this strange, fragile thing called life. That night, when I got home, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. The moon hung low, silver and soft, and the world outside was hushed. I thought about how far I had come from that first winter when everything felt lost. Now, the silence was no longer empty. It was full, full of color, of memory, of quiet strength. I traced my finger along the rim of the glass and whispered to myself, "I'm still here." And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. Summer came like a slow bloom, golden and alive. The air grew heavier, filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and something sweet I could never quite name. The studio stayed busier than ever, sunlight pouring through the tall windows as the hours slipped by unnoticed. Sometimes I would lose myself so completely in painting that I'd forget the world outside existed. My brushes had become like extensions of my hands, each movement carrying pieces of emotion I couldn't put into words. One afternoon, as I was cleaning up, Ruth mentioned that a local magazine wanted to feature our art program. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. They wanted to write about how it had brought people together, how it gave a second chance to those who thought their best years were gone. When the reporter arrived a week later, I was nervous. She asked me about my journey, how it began, what it meant to start again at 70. Her questions were gentle but direct, and answering them felt like peeling back layers I hadn't touched in a long time. I told her the truth, that I began painting to escape the silence, and somewhere along the way, the silence became my companion instead of my prison. When the article came out, my children called. I hadn't realized how long it had been since we'd had a real conversation. They told me how proud they were, how surprised they felt seeing their mother in print, smiling beside her paintings. My daughter said she framed the article and placed it in her living room. My son sent flowers with a small note that read, "You've always been an artist. You just forgot for a while." I cried when I read it. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote letters to each of them, not about art or the article, but about small memories, birthday mornings, bedtime stories, the smell of rain during school vacations. I wanted them to remember that life is made of such moments, the ones we often overlook while chasing the larger ones. Weeks later, the magazine story brought more visitors to our studio. People I had never met came just to watch us paint. Some stayed, picking up brushes for the first time, trembling like I once did. I saw myself in their uncertainty, that fear of starting late, and I tried to remind them that beginnings don't belong to the young, they belong to the willing. The summer days melted into evenings of soft laughter and shared stories. We would sit outside after class, the sun dipping low, our hands stained with color. The cicadas sang their endless tune, and someone always brought lemonade. It felt like time had paused, letting us live in a slow, beautiful loop. One night, Ruth brought out her old photo album. She told us about her husband, about how they used to travel with nothing but a car, a map, and a dream. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke, though I could see the sadness resting quietly beneath her words. When she looked at me, she smiled and said, We're all finding our way back to something, aren't we? I nodded, feeling the truth of it. Painting had given me back a part of myself, but it also gave me the courage to face the parts I still kept hidden. That evening, when I returned home, I walked through every room of my house, looking at the paintings on the walls. Each one told a piece of my story: the loneliness, the rediscovery, the quiet joy of belonging again. They were more than pictures, they were proof of healing. I stopped by the mirror and caught a glimpse of myself. My face had changed, lines deepened, hair silvered, but my eyes, they looked alive again. I smiled at my reflection, realizing that aging doesn't steal your beauty, it reshapes it. It turns it inward, where it glows quietly instead of demanding to be seen. As the days went on, the studio began to feel less like a project and more like a sanctuary. People came with their grief, their hope, their hunger for meaning. They left with color on their hands and something lighter in their hearts. I could see it in the way they walked out the door, standing a little taller. I think that's what art really is: a mirror for the soul, showing you that you still exist. One afternoon, I found myself painting a self-portrait. I hadn't planned to, it just happened. I worked on it for days, layering shades of blue and soft pink, letting instinct guide me. When it was done, I stood back and looked at it. It wasn't a perfect likeness. My hands had softened the lines, but there was a light in the eyes, a warmth I hadn't noticed in years. That painting now hangs in my living room. Every morning I see it as I sip my coffee by the window, and it reminds me that I chose to live again. The world outside keeps moving. Seasons come and go. People pass by without knowing my story, but I no longer feel invisible. I feel present, grounded, a part of something larger than myself. One evening, after everyone had left the studio, I stayed behind to clean. The light through the windows had turned amber, painting the room in gold. I paused for a moment, just standing there, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond. The smell of paint and turpentine filled the air, familiar and comforting. I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to life, to time, to the stubborn hope that refused to die in me. I had once believed that my story was ending, but now I understood it had only shifted, taken on new colors. Maybe that's what growing older is: not losing chapters, but rewriting them with softer hands and a braver heart. When I locked the door that night, the sky above was deep purple, the first stars beginning to show. I walked home slowly, the evening air warm on my skin, carrying with me the simple truth that it's never too late to start again. And maybe that's the real art of living. Autumn came quietly, the kind that creeps in through the windows with a cool breath and settles into the corners of the house like memory. The trees outside my window began to turn amber and red, their leaves fluttering down in soft spirals. I found myself painting them often, not just for their beauty, but because they reminded me how graceful change could be. There was something comforting about watching the world prepare to let go. I had learned that letting go was not about loss, but about trust. Trust that something new would come, even if you didn't yet know its shape. The studio felt different in those months. The summer chatter had softened into a quiet rhythm. Ruth had started working on a series of portraits, and I spent long hours beside her, each of us lost in our own small worlds, but connected through the gentle sound of brushes moving across canvas. Sometimes we didn't speak for hours, and it was still the most peaceful kind of company. One evening, as I was cleaning my brushes, Ruth told me she was moving to live with her daughter. Her voice trembled a little when she said it, though she tried to sound cheerful. I felt something tighten in my chest. I had grown used to her laughter, her steady presence beside me. I smiled, told her I was happy for her, and meant it, even though a quiet ache settled somewhere deep inside me. We hugged before she left, her arms warm and familiar. When she walked out the door, the studio suddenly felt larger, quieter, almost too still. For days, I caught myself glancing at the chair she used to sit in. Change has a way of sneaking up, no matter how much you think you've made peace with it. To fill the silence, I began working on something bigger than anything I had ever painted before, a large canvas that took up nearly the entire wall. It was meant to be about the seasons, but as it grew, I realized it was about life itself, the cycles of beginning and ending, the beauty of imperfection, the persistence of color through it all. I painted every morning, often before the sun rose. The light at that hour was different, tender and forgiving. As the brush moved, I felt as if I was painting not just with color, but with memory. My husband's laughter, my children's voices, the quiet afternoons when I had once believed my story was done. All of it seemed to find its way into the strokes. There were moments when I would step back and see shapes that I hadn't planned, faces in the texture, the hint of a sky that looked like a dream I once had. It was strange how art could pull pieces of your soul into the open without asking permission. Around that time, the community center decided to organize a winter exhibition, and they asked me to display my new piece. My first instinct was to refuse. The idea of standing in front of people, of being seen that closely, made my heart race. But something inside me said, yes. Maybe it was the same small voice that had whispered "not yet" years ago, when I thought my days had no meaning left. Preparing for that show became a journey of its own. I spent weeks perfecting details, cleaning edges, varnishing the canvas until it glowed under the light. On the day of the exhibition, I wore a soft blue dress, the same shade I had used in the sky of my painting. When I arrived, the room was already filled with people. The air buzzed with conversation, the soft clink of glasses, and the faint sound of a piano playing somewhere in the corner. My painting stood at the far end of the hall, taller than I remembered, bathed in warm light. I watched as people stopped in front of it, their faces thoughtful, their eyes tracing the colors. A woman touched my arm and asked if I was the artist. When I nodded, she smiled and said, "It feels like peace." Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. Later that night, as the crowd began to thin, I stood in front of my painting alone. I thought of all the moments that had led to that one, the loneliness, the rediscovery, the laughter, the tears. I realized that the painting wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever believed their best years were behind them. I left the gallery feeling light, as though I had finally exhaled after holding my breath for years. On my way home, the streets were quiet, leaves gathering in small piles along the sidewalk. The air was cool and sharp, carrying that faint smell of rain and earth. When I reached home, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat by the window and watched the world in its quiet motion. I thought about Ruth and hoped she was happy. I thought about my children, about how they would smile when I told them how it went. Then I thought about the girl I used to be, sitting under that fig tree with a paintbrush and a dream too big for her small hands. I smiled, realizing I had finally painted the life she had once imagined. I wasn't just living anymore. I was becoming. There was a quiet strength in that. As I sat there, the moonlight slipping across the floor, I felt a stillness that wasn't empty but full of gratitude, full of grace. Life had not given me what I expected, but it had given me everything I needed. Sometimes it takes growing old to understand that beauty was never lost. It was simply waiting for us to slow down enough to see it. Winter arrived with a quiet kind of beauty, the kind that wraps itself around everything and slows the world to a hush. I could feel it in the mornings when the frost traced delicate patterns on my window, and the air carried a soft chill that woke me fully before the coffee did. The studio looked different in that light, softer somehow, as if the cold outside had made the colors inside glow warmer. I spent more time there than ever, painting with my sweater sleeves pulled over my hands, a small heater humming near my feet. The big canvas from the exhibition still stood by the wall, but now it felt less like an achievement and more like a companion. I would look at it sometimes while waiting for the paint to dry on new pieces and think about how far I had come without really noticing it. The loneliness that had once felt like a shadow now existed only in echoes, faint reminders of a life lived half awake. I wasn't lonely anymore. I was full, surrounded by small joys that I had once thought were gone for good. The laughter of others in the studio, the smell of paint and coffee blending in the air, the gentle satisfaction of seeing color bloom where there was once blankness. It all reminded me that creation itself was a kind of prayer, a way of saying, I'm still here. One day, as I was working on a small landscape, I received a letter from Ruth. Her handwriting was as lively as her voice used to be. She wrote about her new home, her grandchildren, and the joy of teaching them how to paint. She said she missed our evenings together, the smell of turpentine, and the way we used to sit quietly after class, watching the light fade through the tall windows. At the end, she wrote, Keep painting, my dear. You found yourself there. Don't ever stop. I pressed that letter to my chest and let the warmth of it spread through me. I wrote back that night, telling her about the exhibition, the people who came, and how her spirit still filled the room, even when she wasn't there. The act of writing to her made me realize how much my world had grown since that first night I picked up a brush again. I wasn't just painting pictures anymore. I was painting connections, memories, pieces of love scattered across time. The seasons continued to turn, and soon snow began to fall, blanketing everything in silence. I would walk to the studio with my scarf pulled high, the cold biting my cheeks, and the world around me still and silver. Those walks became my favorite part of the day, the sound of snow crunching under my boots, the way breath turned visible in the air, the soft glow of lights from houses. It all felt like a gentle reminder that life was still unfolding, even in quietness. At the studio, the windows would fog up, and inside it always smelled faintly of pine and warmth. Everyone painted slower in winter, their movements thoughtful, deliberate, as if each brushstroke carried the weight of reflection. I started working on a new series then, small canvases that told stories of moments I didn't want to forget. The scent of rain from childhood, my husband's hands when they held mine, the soft laughter of my children when they were small. Each piece felt like a whisper from the past, and when I finished one, I would sit for a while just looking at it, feeling both joy and ache at once. One evening, as I was locking up, I caught my reflection in the studio glass. The snow outside had begun again, falling steady and slow, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. I saw the woman I had become, not the widow, not the aging mother, but someone whole, layered with stories, softened by loss, brightened by creation. I smiled at her and whispered, You did it. The drive home that night was quiet. The radio played softly, and the roads shimmered under the glow of streetlights. When I reached home, I left my coat by the door and walked straight to my easel in the corner of the living room. There was a blank canvas waiting, and I felt an urge to start right then, without thought, without planning. I picked up the brush and began to paint the snow outside, the quiet, the light, the stillness that had begun to feel like peace. The colors were soft and muted, grays and silvers with hints of blue, but beneath them I added warmth, tiny touches of gold, traces of pink, the colors that reminded me of the life beating underneath the calm. Hours passed before I realized it was almost morning. The first light was creeping through the curtains, turning the snow outside into diamonds. I stepped back and looked at what I had created. It was simple, gentle, but alive. It wasn't just snow on canvas. It was me, in this moment of quiet gratitude. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat beside it, watching the light grow stronger. I thought about how strange and wonderful it was that at 71, I had found a rhythm that felt new, the kind that doesn't chase after days, but meets them with open hands. Later, as I cleaned my brushes, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't painting to fill time anymore. I was painting to honor it. Every line, every shade was a conversation between who I was and who I had become. There was peace in that, a kind of still joy that needed no audience. I knew then that this, all of it, the quiet mornings, the art, the friendships, even the loss, was my masterpiece. Not the kind that hangs in galleries, but the kind you live one breath at a time. And as the day began, golden and new, I whispered a promise to myself. I would keep painting, not for anyone else, but because it was the truest way I knew to keep living. Spring returned softly that year, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath and was finally ready to exhale. The frost disappeared from the windows. The trees began to bud again, and tiny flowers peeked through the cracks in the pavement like shy reminders of hope. I felt it too, that quiet renewal that comes after a long winter. My mornings grew lighter, not just from the sun filtering through the curtains, but from the warmth inside me that no longer needed convincing. I would open the windows, let the breeze wander through the house, and breathe in the scent of new beginnings. The studio, once a place of escape, had now become my heartbeat. It wasn't just where I painted, it was where I lived most fully. Each day brought someone new to our circle, someone carrying a story stitched with loneliness or longing. And somehow, in the act of creating, we all began to heal together. One woman, a retired teacher, told me she hadn't felt this alive in decades. Another man, quiet and shy, painted only in shades of gray, until one afternoon he added a streak of orange and smiled for the first time. Watching them reminded me how art is less about what we make and more about what it makes of us. I started a new project that spring, something deeply personal. I wanted to paint a series called Seasons of Me, a journey through the stages of my life in color. Childhood was bright and messy, filled with greens and yellows. Youth was bold, a dance of red and gold. Marriage and motherhood became softer hues, warm and grounding. Then came loss, painted in shades of blue so deep they almost swallowed the canvas. But the final piece, the one I was working on now, was about this moment, the rediscovery. I chose lavender for peace, amber for memory, and white for acceptance. It was my way of saying I had arrived somewhere I never thought I would, a place within myself that finally felt like home. Some afternoons, as I worked, I would catch my reflection in the window. The sunlight would fall just right, and for a heartbeat, I would see both the woman I was and the girl I used to be. It made me smile to think they had finally met halfway. One day, the community center invited me to speak to a group of younger artists. At first, I almost refused. I didn't see myself as a teacher, just someone who had stumbled her way back into life through color. But they insisted, and so I said yes. Standing in front of them, I felt nervous, my palms slightly damp, my voice trembling at first. But as I began to speak, the words flowed easier. I told them about the years I had spent doing what was expected instead of what I loved, about the silence that grew heavier with each passing year, and the simple act of one day choosing to pick up a brush again. I watched their faces as I spoke, some curious, some moved, and I realized that maybe my story wasn't just mine. It belonged to anyone who had ever felt left behind by time and dared to reach for something again. When it ended, a young woman came up to me and said she wanted to show her grandmother the article about me, that she thought it might inspire her to start painting again, too. That moment stayed with me long after. I went home that night and cried, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I had once believed my world had grown small, but now it felt infinite. Every color, every face, every laugh in that studio had expanded it in ways I couldn't have imagined. As the weeks passed, I began to feel time differently. It no longer frightened me. The idea of aging had once felt like a slow erasure, but now I saw it as the opposite. Each year had etched its own truth into me, and those truths had become the palette I painted from. I started taking long walks again, not to reach anywhere, but to simply move, to watch the world breathe. The trees that had been bare months ago now swayed with fresh leaves. Birds sang from the rooftops, and the air tasted alive. Sometimes I carried my sketchbook and sat by the pond near the edge of town, capturing reflections on the water or the way sunlight turned ripples into gold. People would pass by, nod, smile, sometimes stop to talk. I never realized how many quiet connections existed in the world until I opened myself enough to see them. One evening, I came home to a letter from the magazine that had written about our studio months before. They wanted to do a follow-up feature on artists who had found purpose later in life. They asked if I would share more about my journey. I laughed to myself, shaking my head, thinking of that woman who had once sat in silence, believing her story was finished. I agreed, of course, not because I needed to be seen, but because I wanted others to know what I had learned. That joy doesn't have an expiration date. That creativity doesn't fade with age. It ripens, it deepens, it becomes more honest. The interview took place a week later, and when they asked what painting meant to me now, I told them simply that it was how I listened to life, that in every brushstroke, I found pieces of myself I hadn't known I'd lost. When they asked about the future, I smiled and said I didn't think about it much anymore. The present felt wide enough, full enough. After they left, I sat in the quiet, my hands still stained with blue, and looked around the room. The walls were alive with color, each painting a heartbeat, a memory, a whisper. The woman I had become no longer feared endings because she had learned to begin again. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the soft hum of the evening, and felt an unshakable peace settle over me. I was still here, still creating, still becoming, and that was enough. Summer arrived like a slow unfolding promise. The air grew heavy with warmth. The days stretched long and golden, and everything seemed to shimmer with quiet possibility. I began to paint outside more often, letting the sunlight mix with the smell of turpentine and fresh grass. My canvas caught the flicker of life around me, the sway of the trees, the distant laughter of children, the delicate trace of clouds melting across the sky. Sometimes I would lose track of time, painting until dusk wrapped everything in that tender orange glow that made the world look softer, almost forgiving. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can find a little warmth and hope in these stories too.